What's up, folks? It's good to see you again. We have a great guest today. His name is Dr. Bruce Deamer. He is I'll just read from his bio here. He's a Canadian-American multidisciplinary scientist, designer, and author. Working as an astrobiologist, Dr. Deamer collaborates with colleagues developing and testing a new scenario for the origin of life on Earth and where it might arise in the universe. He was doing some of this in Iceland too, which was really cool because I just got back from there. And so we were talking about that. As a designer, he has provided innovative spacecraft architectures to NASA and others, which could provide a viable path for expansion of life and civilization beyond the Earth. Really cool. He also was good friends and working with Terence McKenna kind of towards the end of McKenna's life. And you can find some YouTubes of that that are really cool. Maybe we can put the link to that in the Patreon, actually. Dr. Deamer has recently gone on public record that he has used a combination of mindfulness practices and psychedelics to achieve some of his key scientific and technical breakthroughs. His passion in co-funding minds is that many others with special capacities in these realms should have access to mentorship, scientifically validated protocols, and pathways to transform their own novel discoveries into solutions to bring about a brilliant future. Minds, the multidisciplinary investigation into novel discoveries and solutions. Very cool guy. The conversation went all around. It meandered all over the place. But really, really cool person. If you like Paul Stamets and you like and you like Terence McKenna and you like all the different people kind of in that orbit, you're going to love Dr. Bruce Deamer. That's for sure. All right, you enjoy. This thing went kind of long, and so there's, I think, like a whole nother 20 minutes on Patreon. So head on over to Patreon, patreon.com/Comes a Time Pod, and get those extras. Come see us on YouTube, and peace. I was watching some of you with Terence McKenna. That was cool. I was like, oh, man.
Yeah, the times with Terence were really fantastic. You know, it was toward the end of his life, but man, did we go on an adventure together. Just totally. I mean, my adventure was to introduce him to cyberspace, like avatars and virtual worlds, which is a total dream for him because, you know, he was all about invisible landscapes and that code and language creates reality. And so here we are at his house in early 99, putting him into a virtual world, and he chose his avatar and he called it Zone Ghost. And later on, in a collection of letters that came to me, because I'm an archivist too, he's got this letter from 1995 that says, "I want to be a zone ghost of cyberspace." And it was, so there's a whole thing now. We're kind of talking about the virtual Terrence's, we call him Zone Ghost because that was his desire. And then, of course, Terence introduced me to hyperspace.
Interesting. Now, how did, in what way?
A bag of mushrooms arrived from trusted sources.
And away you went.
Away I went. And of course, you know, Terence, one of some of his advice was always the following: get a scale. Get a scale. So you can measure the dose. And I didn't have a scale. I was
don't just take. Yeah, we got to know.
Don't eat the entire bag that comes to you. You know.
Speaking of that, you know, I said in my email that life is in the tangents, but sometimes these bags will, you know, come to us in Dead and Company, and I'll take one look at it, and I'm like, oh no, 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 no. I can look at those things, and it just looks like, scary.
It's
Very strong.
they're a little scary, right? Because they have, as Terence has said, they have bodies. It's not that there are no body. There are bodies, and they're an entity. They have that bluish tinge to them, and the listeners will know what we're talking about here.
There was the bag that I was thinking about in question. Had that when I saw that blue stuff, I was like, I'm the micro guy. I like to get a little sparkly and just like, if at all,
Well,
But I do think there's this thing. Well, you go ahead.
Terence, don't feel as though you're a chicken running around the barnyard, because Terence would say every time that he took his like 5 to 7 grams, when he wanted to do heroic dose, he would be absolutely full of the heebie-jeebies and just shaking, and like he would talk every time, right? And so
how could you not be?
I like curanderos in the Amazon talk about a lifetime of ayahuasca practice, and they say there's still dimensions. It goes on. It's infinite.
Yes,
it goes on
infinite.
Forever. They don't know the end of it, and
yes,
it's just extraordinary that we have access to these domains in our time.
Absolutely, and I didn't think we would be coming to this so quickly. And I know we're going to go around a bunch of things, but this idea keeps coming to me that, and I'm pretty sure I've heard Stamets say it and other people say it, where the mushrooms are actually teaching you. And sometimes it's not confined to just mushrooms. Like you hear a lot of indigenous people or people that are just outdoorsy people say that nature will teach you. There's like it's an entity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is perhaps, I think, the great mystery of our time, is that when we contact, you could call them a realm, you could call them an invisible landscape, but in that realm are beings. Now, are those beings created by our subconscious? Are they floating? Are they archetypes, as Jung would talk about, or what are they? And it is one of the great mysteries. And of course, these realms and these interactions, these relationships are accessible also through many practices, right? I mean, many, many practices, these apparitions come to us, and from whence they come and how they show up, and do we listen? What I can report to you on the high dose of mushrooms, of psilocybin, you enter realms that are so extraordinary. So if you ever get your muster up with Dave to go to the high dose territory, it's something. So here's an example of what I mean by the high weirdness, as Eric Davis calls it. You as you're launching, you get this hard launch feeling where you're like on the space shuttle and it's surging forward to orbit. And you get that feeling, you feel it in your gut, you feel it in your whole body, you might feel nausea or something.
Yeah.
And then you start approaching orbit. And only then, when you think, oh my God, I never thought I would come back here. Because you can't pattern a memory of that space in ordinary waking consciousness. So it's only as you approach, the singularity, if you will, you have a memory of what it was like. So we actually can't bring it back with us. And and you're like, oh my God, I never thought I'd go back here. And every cell in your body is like, no, they'll pull the ripcord, and you can't. And you just sort of give into it, give over to it, and try to dissolve yourself in all these nominal but important little resistances of, oh my God, what's happening? I mean, it's your psyche, it's your body, it's everything. And then you break through, and then you're in orbit. You're at 800 miles or something. And my God, it's a space that's, un-Englishable, as Terence used to say,
Yes.
but it was Irishable. It was Irishable, and the Grateful Dead, we talked about that in our communication. They learned how to play into and through that space early on, like November of 1965, at the ranch, at the spread, Ken Babbs and Kesey and the Pranksters. And, what was reported to us by Ken Babbs at the 50th anniversary party that was held down here was that they heard their instruments being played outside. So they're in the ranch house. They're in their high with LSD at the time. This is early. This is just about the time of criminalization of LSD. Yeah. And they heard. So Ken heard Kesey's guitar being played, and they look outside, and there are the Grateful Dead, and they're playing the Merry Pranksters instruments that they've sort of, purloined from the house, because the band of Merry Pranksters, they were also a band. People don't know this, but and what they were doing, what Garcia and the others were doing, was figuring out how to do it, how to communicate with that high realm using their tools of their trade. And it was that night that the Dead was really born. It was really extraordinary. I recorded that conversation. It's in my podcast, in the Levity Zone. You can hear Babs describing this.
I definitely want to hear that. He came on our podcast once. That was a great talk. Yeah. I think music definitely that's one of the ways that I've always done it, even going back to like playing an African drumming group. If you're drumming for hours, it's an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah.
I think that's why we tend towards improv. Improv is that same thing. It's like there's a going out beyond just the known, and it's an altered state of consciousness.
Yeah, the rhythmicness. I mean, it's true magic tech. It truly is.
Well, you said something that really struck me, talking about, the origin of life and how it required these cycles, and it kind of overlapped with, like mushrooms teaching you and nature teaching you, because this is something that happens with me, is if I get into a groove, just rhythmically, like we're talking just rhythm, just drums. Once I get locked into the groove, locked into the cycle of, where the accents are, where it pushes and pulls, all I have to do is repeat it. And then all of a sudden the groove is telling me these other things to play. They imply it, they pull your hands toward it. So it's almost like I can't really take credit for it. What I could take credit for is getting in the groove and getting locked into the cycle. And then like what you were saying, like the way life happens, like the bathtub grout or whatever,
Yeah, the bathtub grout.
Yeah, something happens by itself, right? Like, and then all of a sudden its life is going on its own.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. Have you unpacked that about the cycles and how that plays into it? Because I find a connection with rhythm.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about origin of life is that it is a pattern cycle. And if you think about it, and for the listeners, I'm an astrobiologist. I'm a scientist that works at the edge, the boundary between life and non-life. And so if you reach back far enough, you come to the early Earth, which is in what's known as the Hadean realm. And Hadean means hell realms.
Hades.
Hades. And this was thought to be about 4 billion, it was around 4 billion years ago that life could have emerged. And here you have this planet with pink skies and asteroid impacts and a kind of chocolate-colored ocean full of dissolved iron, maybe more of a green-colored ocean, red landscapes, volcanoes just roaring everywhere, like huge volcanic archipelagos, a really alien world, a super toxic world. But what you do have is bubbling pools, and they're just like Old Faithful at Yellowstone today. Every once in a while, something bubbles up and pushes up, and there might be a full geyser, and water is flowing, and that's the beginning of the rhythm. So the rhythm also comes in from a daily showering of sunlight. Our planet's rotating into the beautiful radiation of the sun, so that's another rhythm. And then you have, dew forming in the morning on sheens of rock, and then that dries off. Another rhythm. And then these hot springs that fill, volcanic hot springs. And then every once in a while, there's a showering of dust that comes down and fills the pools with dust from the forming solar system, that is a disk around the entire sun of all this dust. And it's still there. You can see it every once in a while in the night sky. You can see this zodiac light that is shining up, and it's the sun shining off the disk of dust. And the dust contains organics. So with meteorites and dust particles, the pools are fed. And so you've got this stirring pot of soup that's being, isn't it an amazing kind of a thing? Yeah. And we actually take our science to those very pools, not 4 billion years ago, but places like in Kamchatka, or not so much Hawaii, because the water just disappears down into the lava, right? It percolates. But Iceland and Yellowstone and New Zealand, we can find these pools, and we try our chemistry in the cycling. I take a pipetter and I actually take acidic water and put it into our little vials, and we are forming in the bathtub ring sludge a mixture of layers of lipid, which are basically how you're made. I mean, you're a bag of lipid walking along with your skin. This is all cell walls, and inside the cell wall, of course, is RNA and DNA and these protein compounds. That's how we work. But what we've been able to do is to form those in the lab and in hot spring settings, form those little bags that contain these little polymers, RNA, DNA, and little short protein called peptides. And we find trillions of them moving around. When I take that pipetter and I put a drop into the vial, the dried bathtub ring bursts off and forms these things we call protocells, and we can stain them and see them as glowing objects. And then they dry down again and they form a clump. And the clump is like the feeding zone. And in any protocell that survived going through the water phase goes into the drying out gel phase. It gets hit by sunlight, a pulse of sunlight instead of a pulse of water. And that's energy. And it's like the feeding zone. And then it dries down to this, whatever you call it, the sludge of a bathtub ring. And in there, the seeds are formed. Because you're drying down, you can form more and more of these long, stringy polymers. And then I put another drop in, and it forms more protocells. And so over a few hours, we can form long, long chains of an RNA-like thing inside these compartments. And we've been doing this for 10, 15 years, and finally have really convinced our colleagues that instead of looking deep in the oceans where you have these hydrothermal vents, or just you've seen them on TV documentaries, that it really is more like hot springs is where you can get life started. And Charles Darwin even thought this 150 years ago. He wrote in a letter like, oh, what if, in a big if, that in some warm little pond somewhere life can start, because proteins form and get more complex. And he nailed it in 1871, right? Charles Darwin, just scribbling a letter to his friend. And that was the clue we had that we kind of ignored until Dave Deamer and I sort of helped to bring hot springs back onto the table of the soup pots of life.
It's great, because I was just in Iceland doing our last record.
Oh, yeah?
Yep, I was just there, and in the hot springs, first thing in the morning and last thing before I went to bed. So it's funny, and I was struck by, because it's so Arctic and then so volcanic at the same time. It's so cold, but there's just some lava everywhere.
Yeah.
And the volcano was erupting as we left,
Wow.
So when we were flying out, after being in like 4 feet of snow for 9 days, we're flying out and you can just see the volcano just going off. It really, it feels more magical there, I gotta say.
Yeah, and that's in some ways you stepped onto the crunchy landscape of our beginnings. Because Iceland's a really good model for the early Earth. And Dave and our postdoc Kovalas just came back from there in the summer, and they found just the right little pools and vents and things to try the experiments again, to repeat them in Iceland.
It's amazing. I wrote down something on here, and it says prebiotic non-enzymatic polymerization. But this, I wrote this thing down before it that says the egg comes first, question mark. You said something about this kind of speaks to the chicken and the egg problem.
Yes.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a fun one, right? Because everyone thinks, well, you need an egg to form chickens, but eggs are made from chickens. So which came first? And if you go all the way back, you discover something else. There's a third component there that we missed, which is the chicken yard.
It's not binary.
It's not binary. That actually the right chicken yard leads to the formation of the first egg that can barely generate a chicken. But then the chicken goes and makes a better egg. And so it's the scratch zone. And we have chickens here at Ancient Oaks, but it's the scratch zone where I just let them out of their run this morning. They race out and they start kicking stuff up. And then they start pecking, looking for beetles and stuff with the proteins. And they're new chickens, so they haven't laid their first egg. And we think any day we're gonna hear the sound of a chicken laying an egg. And so that really is, it's the ideal chicken yard came first. It beget the first proto egg, which made the first proto chicken, which then made a better proto egg.
So you were trying to do this off-world, create this life. Was this part of your work with NASA?
Yeah, so here's the fun. It gets even more fun. So back about 18 years ago, the Spirit rover, one of those pair of rovers that were landed on Mars like in 2004, it's trundling along and one of its wheels stops turning. And it's in this great big sort of crater area. And, they can kind of keep it going, but the wheel doesn't turn anymore. Maybe there's a pebble caught in it. And as they drive it, it turns it into a trenching tool. So it pillows up all this sand and material. And what they see is this white stuff. So they turn the rover around to like image it, because the white stuff isn't snow, right? Because Mars is such a thin atmosphere that any water just immediately just sublimates out. It turns out it's opaline silica. It's the white kinds of pebbly, sandy material that are made in hot springs. So they found an ancient hot spring on Mars about the age of, it's like an old Yellowstone. It's like the vestiges of a hot spring that was bubbling about 3.7 billion years ago. And they're trundling around and realizing, oh, that little flat thing there is a big geyser. It's a former geyser. And Mars preserves its geology really well because it doesn't have water and doesn't have a lot of ways to erode things. So Mars is like a huge sarcophagus there's a mummy in there, and Mars is just super ancient. And so it seemed to be like, oh my gosh, there were hot springs on Mars that look exactly like the ones that you find in Chile, for example, up in the Atacama Desert, the Andes. And it's the same material. And they looked down and they found these little finger-like rocks everywhere. Those are called digitate silica nodules, and it's the same kinds of rocks in Chile. They're packed full of microbiota, little bacteria. And so we may have found in that one mission the best place to preserve life if it existed on Mars. And what we need to do is go back and pick those nodules up and get them back to Earth. But if life existed or started on Mars, it's probably living in the rocks deep down, because the surface is sterilizing. It's just and so it needs water, and it needs warmth. It needs a source of energy, which would be out of the rocks. So that's Martian life. No green little men, not even any green little microbes, because they're not using sunlight.
Funny, man. It's funny you say Atacama, because it reminds me of those bodies that they found with the really long skulls, and they're really teeny and up there. And I think it's Chile. They call it the Atacama something. That's weird.
it's amazing. Well, some of that stuff is fake, right? Some of that,
yes.
But the high Andes also contains evidence for the Incan civilization's use of DMT. Switching back to drug talk here. They found evidence for snuffs and for ferments, complex chemical admixtures that the Incan civilizations could do. They had master chemists, and they created these either drinks or snuffs, and out of local berries that contained a couple kinds of DMT. And of course, there's coca leaf. There were mushrooms from further north, in Mesoamerica, and there's ayahuasca, which is an admixture of a vine and a leaf, that worked. And it's thought by archaeologists, or sort of, you could call them, ethnobiologists, that the Incans were just the absolute master chemists to create psychoactive mixtures, and that the entire civilization from cradle to grave were using these kinds of medicines. So it wasn't necessarily only accessible by a priesthood, like you had, for example, the Eleusis in Greece, perhaps. Yes. But it was baked into the civilization for everyone.
I heard someone describing recently on some podcast the recipe for it, and how would you have ever known those dosages, to mix it together the right way to get that effect? It's not something you would have come to kind of randomly,
Well, it may have been there was an entire industry of trying stuff out. So one of the thoughts now, at least in that science, and this is not my area of expertise, was that a lot of trade between the Andes and the Incans and tribes down in the Amazon, and that they collected these materials and they tried them. And then, in fact, ayahuasca might have been a creation of Incan civilization or pre-Incan civilization, because there was an entire class of people trying these potions, just as there was in Europe, in 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. They were just trying stuff out. So they created and then exported the formulas.
They were more methodical than we give them credit for.
Yeah. If they could build Machu Picchu, they were methodical people.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk to you about, I know I'm bouncing around here, but I noticed you mentioning non-duality, which is a big subject that I'm into. And I'm guessing this ties into minds.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that for us?
Well, the just taking the listeners back in history, so we've used psychoactive compounds forever as a species to initiate our young, back tens of thousands of years ago. the Eleusinian mysteries that Brian Muraresku writes about in his book, The Immortality Key, could have been a psychoactive rite to initiate civilization itself. So people came out of their initiation with a certain clarity of mind, and they went to the academy and created algebra and they, geometry and things like this, and engineers went off and made aqueducts, and political people went off and created the tricameral house of governance in ancient Greece. So all these are really cool innovations that aren't naturally, you wouldn't naturally think of them emerging so quickly. And it may have been that these mystery schools help people sort of unsort their mind and maybe undergo some sorts of healing, as we now know that these medicines can do. But with it, when they switch to being elixirs of revealing, if you've had any kind of a deep, profound session, even in composing some music or recording an album or something, for the next few days, you probably notice you're in a flow state. So something has happened. And so what we decided to do about 2.5 years ago is to see whether or not we could bring back the science around psychedelics and other practices in going from our healing, which we all need. There's a lot of psychedelic research is about working with trauma or addiction, and start looking at the revealing side. Start looking at flashes of insight that might come more easily because we use these tools. And it turns out that way back in the 50s, Aldous Huxley, who was a great British academic and writer, met Humphrey Osmond, who was to later coin the term psychedelic. And they got together as friends, and Humphrey brought a bottle of mescaline to Huxley's house in Los Angeles, and he had his first trip. And he later wrote the book Doors of Perception, which was the inspiration for the band The Doors. And it's an earlier term from the 19th century, but Huxley's book came out in 1954, and it kind of launched psychedelia in the West again. And at the same time, these two guys came up with this idea they called outsight. They said, well, clearly, these tools or medicines or whatever you call them give us insight into our self, our psyches, but can they also give us outsight into the world? Even problem solving in science and engineering and incredible designs that can download to us. And research started, and in the mid 60s, there were studies of professionals, working on problems like design a shopping center or come up with a new way to study the way photons interact with materials. And Michael Pollan describes this one study by Harman, where 2/3 of the participants had breakthroughs, after their mescaline session.
Yeah.
So all that came to a crashing halt in 1965 with criminalization, and we've only brought back the therapeutic side since around 2000. And so MINDS was established, and MINDS stands for Multidisciplinary Investigation into Novel Discoveries and Solutions. And it's a cool name, right? MINDS.
It is.
We were based upon the earlier success of the organization called MAPS, which is based here in the Bay Area, and that's Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And so we thought if we could create a nonprofit that would bring in donor dollars from people who had impacts on their life, they built companies, they'd had insights, that we could get science started on studying this. And we got our paperwork only a year ago. We've already done so much. We've had great support. It's a fantastic group of people have come together around it. And we're about to announce our first study at UT Austin, and that's psilocybin and its effect on memory. So good old mushrooms, they're it's called processing fluency. The idea that psilocybin allows you to be more fluent in your processing of your thoughts and accessing memories and putting them together in more fluent ways, less convergent around, oh, I've got to work on this. Oh, all kinds of things are coming to you.
Yes.
So that's already underway, that study. And we're hoping to fund dozens more studies and try to get science to say, hey, this works, validate it. And so that then we can valorize it in society where companies, have programs for their creative people to help them become more creative, healed, and then revealed. Why not?
I mean, Silicon Valley has been doing this anyway. They've been microdosing and working on all this high-tech stuff. And, they were the people that created a lot of that stuff were deadheads. And
yeah, and I mean, Steve Jobs, he talks about his acid trips being profoundly important for him. And what I think that acid, and I know the fellow who was with Steve when he took his first acid trips, and
wow.
it created a fearlessness. In Steve Jobs, it created this sense, I can change the world. I can go in and make a better thing. I have the power to do that. I'm not just some geeky kid at a Homestead High School that, was interested in tech. And I've got a workbench, electronics workbench in a garage.
Yeah.
No, I can really do things. And it gave him that fearlessness to push forward. It totally changed him. I mean, he must have been around 20 years old or 18, 19 years old or something. And so Steve Jobs did change our reality. I mean, I'm on a Mac now and I have an iPhone. And it's all from the genius but the personal drive of Steve. And Steve personally, his hand is on the shape of the Macintosh computer, on the rounded corners of the interface and the design of the case and the reinvention of music through iTunes. It just went on and on. I mean, there was no limit to what he felt he could take his creative mind to. And he had great people like Johnny Ive and stuff that, brought it to fruition.
But I think the great superpower of humans is being able to envision it. If you could see it, you're like, oh, wait a minute. If I could see it in my head, it's possible. And then after that, it's just a matter of if you have the personality type to try to bring it onto this 3D plane, but there's a part of this thing, I feel like it feels like a download. It feels like what religious people would call revelation or, or a vision. For me, it's an auditory vision. It's like I can hear something, it won't go away. Okay, let me try to bring it into focus, orally and pull it down into 3D, But there's this part of it that is, I'm not sure is coming from me,
Yeah, and
it's almost like I'm connecting with some field, and then all of a sudden I get a peek into it, or I can hear it, or see it, or whatever, and then.
And okay, we're back to the question of the day, which is this magical realm, or this speaking to, or these visions, and the visions, from whence do they come? And so the question that most fascinates me these days is, if we look at those little protocells forming, this is where it all kind of links together. Little protocells form into clumps, and then they get more sophisticated, and then through a kind of selection, a kind of search engine, they find all these functions of the little polymers that lead to the living world, right? So we actually have a map for that. But at the same time, as they're coming together, are they creating some kind of overall linking field, overall fuzzy dynamic?
Yeah.
Because we can't see it now. So we talk about non-dual experience and all that sort of stuff. We're in the forest. We can't see individual trees. It's so dense. We're creatures of this thing. But if we look at life's emergence, can we actually watch how it's creating a probabilistic field around itself. And if we can see that, it will be as important a discovery in the 21st century as smashing atoms in the 20th to see the structure of matter and energy and stuff. But so we take life down to its little atom and break it apart and watch how life forms. It form this field that, say, Rupert Sheldrake talks about morphic resonance, for example. Yes. And Carl Jung talked about a synchronous field. Like we sense that we're in something that has a kind of meta intelligence, and that even our visions are somehow downloaded from within ourselves, but also we're reaching out into this great cloud or something. And that's, for me, an incredible fascination, because the vision that I had with ayahuasca that led to this hypothesis for the origin of life, that vision was extraordinary. You know, I became one of those protocells one night 10 years ago in the jungle. I literally woke up as a protocell and watched my own body attempting its division to try to create the first division. And this, after, in the same session, I had witnessed and become my own inception and birth, because I was trying to unravel how I was born, because I was born and then given up for adoption. And the vision, the capacity of that space, or that entity, if you call it Mama Ayahuasca, to show me my own birth, and then give me understanding and insight as to how I booted up, how I was made, and then turning around with the same Mama Ayahuasca and going back and becoming the birth of all of life. That was one 10-minute period. The music had stopped. Our group was taking a break, and there were no Icaros being played. And then it happened in that little gap, this two thing. And then to bring that back, that download, and turn it into the science. So how to land it. You mentioned that earlier. How do you land this in the world? And so that's my own story of doing just that, and turning it into something that we can test, that worked in the lab, that worked out in Iceland.
It reminds me, when you describe that, of a scene in the movie Altered States with William Hurt 18 million years ago, where, he was in the float tank, and my memory's faulty of it, but it seems like he was devolving, you know what I mean? What an experience to have, to go back that far. I mean, can you describe a little bit more of what? I know it's probably not really words for that, but
well, hey, the key thing was preparation, the prepared self, or the prepared mind, because I'd done maybe 5 years of science with Dave, reading all the papers, looking at where the science had got to so far, and pounding up against the open question of, yes, we can make these little glowing protocells, but then what? And so the combination of embodying the dividing protocell, watching the polymers make their crazy moves, watching little action, the code running, having it as a huge open question, and then 4 months later, the question resolved in a trip just from breath work, just from yoga and breath work. I fell into another reverie, if you will, and the whole system downloaded. It's like the incubation time had been like 3 months. And luckily I'm a cartoonist by training way back, and I could draw it all out.
That's handy.
So a 45-minute download, followed by sketching and writing and sending it off to Dave and saying, here it is. And he wrote back, you found it. You found the kinetic trap, which is another way of saying eureka. Yeah. And so we had found that the complete cycle of protocells are made. They go into water. They come back into this gel. They merge together. The polymers that are the glowing bits then go into the layers, and they're coupled. So the polymers are in this kinetic trap of cycling, and then they start wiggling together. They start breaking up. They get more complex, but they don't ever go down to mush. They're lifted constantly, which is
So these are the prebiotic, non-enzymatic polymerization that I was asking you about before. Okay.
That's it.
Got you.
That's it. That's the nerd chemistry language. Because you have to make it palatable for the audience, and that's the audience of very conservative chemists and thermodynamicists, and so then to convince them, right? It's a hazing exercise. It's science. They're going to knock you down, and it can't just be a vision. And that's the problem. Almost,
that's the problem.
Right? You get a lot of people who come out of heightened states of consciousness with theories of everything, but then they never get them peer reviewed. They never question them and put them out for testing. And so
that's more recent, though, because one of the people I follow a lot, Jeffrey Kripal, talks about, many, if not most of our greatest scientists had their revelations the same way,
Yeah.
And spoke about it. It's just not talked about. It's part
not
of that.
Talked about. In fact,
or the Emperor's New, just like, wow, gaslighting on an academic scale,
Yeah, you got to be careful. So about the time I went out to Rice University, I was in a conference in Houston and sat down for lunch with Jeffrey. And I told him this story, and I think this is around 2017 or 16 or 17. At the same time, the New Yorker called me to do this profile. And halfway through the interview, I said, "You know what? I can't talk about this with my name." And they said, "Well, we can't run the story," because I said, "I'll risk the science." I'm on NASA review panels, and I'm, a colleague's, any kind of disparaging remark from a colleague could damage Dave's science and my science. And it wasn't till 2022 that I felt ready to go public. And it turns out that just this year, my colleague Dave, who's my senior and my mentor, had a call from one of these very renowned chemists, and Dave said, "Well, he mentioned something on the call." He said, "So Deamer uses ayahuasca." And I said to Dave, "And what else did he say?" He said, that was it. That was it. And I thought, we've crossed the Rubicon.
Wow, because it wasn't a negative connotation.
No, it was curiosity. Finally. Yeah, and it was curiosity. It wasn't. Yeah, so it was. It reached the objective I had of waiting so long, that the science was solid. And so that this particular scientist was like, "Wow, Deamer used, ayahuasca as a tool to come up with this breakthrough," because it was recognized as a breakthrough by then. It's helped paradigm shift the entire field of where life can start and where to look for it. It's been a major big deal. And so it's kind of in the bag, or in the can, if you will.
Well, the timing is interesting, because 2017 is when the New York Times also broke all the UFO stuff. Mm-hmm. Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal and Lou Elizondo and all that stuff came out. So that was a major shifting point for, a lot of these things, for where Kripal also himself and now many others are brave enough to go, "Hey guys, this is bullshit." Like, we need to be looking at this, And
I
seriously.
think for me, I can't really, UAPs and things like that are not my area. But what is my area is something that hopefully will yield some fruit in a generation or two, which is, what is the nature of life itself? And then that informs us, what is the nature of our consciousness? And if we're connected to a larger field, let's learn how to ping it. Let's learn how to, how to interact with it. And is that field, the spirit? Is it God? Is it, what is that?
What's interesting is that is the UAP discussion now. What you just said. That's and all the materialist guys, that have had all these weird things happen to them from studying the nuts and bolts side of the UAP thing. now, and they brought it home with them, and now their wife's like, what's going on? Their kids are like, what's going on? They're like, what's going on? The whole thing that you just said, that's in a nutshell what the UAP, aside from the people that are just still going to be the materialist science.
Well, that Terence is very critical of the UFO community because
he should be. It's awful too. But
what he concluded was that perhaps that phenomena is a contact in our psyches.
That's the question in the UAP field now. It's like, is it us?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't know if you're familiar with Jacques Vallée and the whole thing of going back through fairy lore, elves, gnomes, whatever, all across the globe, every culture. They all come up as, there's a light, and then there's a little person, and there's,
mm-hmm.
revelation or telepathic contact. I think one of the things that I wrote down here when I saw the videos of you, or maybe it was a video of Terence, he mentioned a logos entity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are we all is this a semantics game? The grays are the elves, are the fairies, are the, angels, jinn, what, like they all have different names, but they kind of describe the same thing.
And it could be that it's a Jungian archetype that's sort of just baked into us. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is. My latest saying is, we are the aliens come to save us. But we've just been gaslit so hard that we don't know that we are, don't believe that we are, don't believe that we can be. I think we all have superpowers, literal ones.
And
literal ones, PK, levitation, see into the future, out of body. What I don't know what mine are, precog dreams, and now some waking precogs. Obviously, I have this music thing, but
mm-hmm.
I think I'm just trying to throw everything at the wall to find them in my kids. I told them, you got superpower. So I really do feel like we are the aliens come to save us. I don't know what it is, but
here's the question for our geeky time. So we're all now geeks, right? 2-3 generations ago, if you used computers,
YouTube.
Yeah, well, if you use computers in like the 80s, people thought, oh, he's a computer person. He's
like a computer nerd.
Weird, right? Now everybody is. Everyone's completely like everybody. So we can apply that. Like, we know that there's code running under things. We're fixing our apps. Like we're crashing the app because we know that some script's gone bad somewhere, and that's top to bottom. That's everybody. And so if we treat all these phenomena as an operating system, like a series of apps, like really tease them apart, because if we load them up with culture and belief, oh, it's God that is touching me and telling me what to do, then we get off, right? We have like several thousand years of knowing that we go off the rails when we do that. But if we treat it just as an OS, and I call it God for geeks,
I like
establish a relationship with it. Like, how does it roll? How does it work? And you find out, for example, if you eat like a double cheeseburger before you go into your ayahuasca session, it's a totally different session. You have to do the dieta. You have to fast. You have to do. And so then you realize, oh my God, it's something to do with my gut. And if you look more deeply at serotonin, and it changes your entire, physical, spiritual nature, having that double cheeseburger. Maybe it works for some, but I think there's plenty of, well, you're going to purge it out too, but still.
Yeah, you're going to throw it out.
But so all grossness aside, the OS of vision of the spiritual realm is also very locked into our bodies in our preparation. So at one time, because I'm such a geek, I'm facing Mama Aya, as an entity, full, colorful presence in front of me, and I said to her, if we're not on the medicine, do you have your own life? Are you like taking frequent flyer trips, around the universe, checking out the human world? Like, do you guys have independent lives in this realm, sat without us being on the medicine? And the voice came back, and it's kind of a voice or a knowing. It's rather than, not English words. No, I need you to co-create me, to manifest me.
Mm.
And I thought, then it's a co-creation.
Yes.
It's us and it's something in the middle. So we don't divorce ourselves and say it's God's will and we have no say in it.
Yeah.
No, you've put into something. Like, it's like if you're running, if there's Zoom is sitting there and there's no one in it, then it's just Zoom. It's sort of dead code or it's cycling in some loop. But as soon as we put ourselves in Zoom, we create the magic of a Zoom meeting. Yes. We have to be there. We have to show up and show up in a certain way. People that know how to get the audio working well and check the audio, and we make it work. And so I think it's even these super conscious realms require us to show up in a sort of a disciplined, clear, clean way. So if you come all anxious, if you're in the day you're all anxious, I think it shakes the field. It's like everyone around you is anxious because you're anxious, and you go into the store and buy something and you're a piss, you're just not being pleasant to anybody, and then it affects everybody in line.
Right? It ripples out.
It ripples out. So then we learn, oh my God, this thing is so sensitive. We have to really care for it. And then it takes it out of the realm of cultural, she said, he said, my tradition versus yours, religious wars and stuff. And it takes it into this personalized, geeky, OS relation dance. That if I prepare myself, I will really rock the field today.
It's sad because, at least in terms of the Christian religion, that's exactly what it teaches, is that you have to be part of the co-creation. Like, you have to show up for it. There's, in some of the older books, maybe it's Mark, I think is the oldest one, where, like, in the difference between Matthew would say he did no miracles. He went there and did no miracles because they didn't believe. But then Mark, I believe, says he couldn't do a miracle because they didn't believe.
Mm.
It's like they weren't showing up for their part in the co-creation. And he says all the time, if you believe, then you could do it. You could do all the same stuff I could do and more. And that doesn't sound like separation to me. It's like, hey, man, come on. If you step into it, you could do all this,
And for musicians, like, can you imagine, in a holy roller ceremony or in a group healing work with a group you really know, my God, the stuff that happens, the stuff that's potentiated with all that intention and that care, and I'd say it, the love that's in that room, all kinds of things can happen because we co-create an intelligence that knows how to move us around the room.
Yes.
And it's
Stefan A. Schwartz?
I don't know.
He does a lot of the stuff about the non-local consciousness. And they did experiments with people laying on of hands and with water, and people, like you said, in like a healing, like just trying to do a miracle healing, like they affected the actual chemical composition of the water.
Yeah, and there's actually work been done at IONS that I've been a part of as an advisor, and they've been working on that. The challenge that they have after 50 years of work over at IONS and all the other studies is what you tend to see is they try to isolate an effect, right?
Yeah.
So there's a person here looking at these visual cue cards, and there's another person and remote viewing and things like this, and precognitive things and whatnot, and it's very hard to repeat it.
It doesn't work like that. Like if someone's uncle dies, It's like you don't want to kill someone's uncle every time just to get him to do something. It doesn't work like that.
So if it doesn't work like that, then we need all new science, right?
Yes.
And in terms of minds, Robin Carhart Harris, who's a eminent psychedelic researcher at UCSF, on one of our calls in the last year, he said, in order to study the full power and effectiveness of creative vision or creativity, we can't divorce it and remove it from its natural ecosystem. We can't have somebody in an fMRI scanner being asked questions like, visualize a brick. What other uses could you have for a brick? And then studying what happens in the mind. You can't do that, right? They'd go to sleep. So what he challenged us was, we need all new science in order to study creativity in its naturalistic setting. And so Manesh Gurn, who's our director of science now at Minds, is actually creating a whole new, what's called a special issue for a journal, where you'll have like 24 authors writing, how do we do this science? How do we study creativity in its naturalistic setting? And all these thinkers come together and create what's called hypothesis construction and experimental design and all these wonderful things that you need to platform a whole new level, a whole new branch of inquiry. And this stuff is hard, not easy. So in some sense, for us, for psychedelic assisted innovation, which is what we're trying to study, we're at sort of step one, restarting it after 55, 60 years. And it will take time and a lot of hard work. But 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we might have the inkling of a kind of an operating system or optimal conditions for these flashes of download to come. Now, we're not talking about sort of spiritual or religious experience. We're talking really sort of geeky experiences, but they have a spiritual component to them.
They are coming from the same place, aren't they?
Right.
We could say that my music that I'm hearing from wherever I'm hearing it from is not have a spiritual component, and that I'm just doing this to play music. But if it's all coming from the same place, does anything not have a spiritual component? And again, I don't want to get hung up in semantics of the word spiritual, but it's almost like, I'm fond of saying there is no science without magic, because you can't measure the thing that's doing the measuring. So our consciousness, or whatever that is, you could call it soul, spirit, mind, I don't know, I don't want to get hung up on the semantics of it, but these things are coming from whatever that place is where all that bag of words fits into or plugs into.
Yeah, I'd agree. And the beauty of all this is that I think we can establish a better relationship with it all, where we know it as it knows us. We come to know it, and then we get better access, right?
Yeah, we need some new language, huh?
Well, when you think about, if you look at one of the great ways to study this is like Malcolm Gladwell, when he talks about put in your 10,000 hours, you become just an incredibly adept agent at doing something. You have your 10,000
rhythmic cycles. You could do 10,000 cycles. And
so one example of that is the Beatles. So the Beatles went to Hamburg and they played at these grungy clubs, thousands of sets, right? They were so trained so that by the time they were on TV in the United States, they just could crank it. These guys could play for 6-7 hours straight, right? They were so good. And then when you see their album sessions, like Yellow Submarine or one of their albums, one of them, like Paul, will have a tune in his head and say, and then the tune is in his head, and then another one of the Beatles would come up with some words, and they'd go straight into the studio and record it from scratch. And
Must be nice.
This was like, 2/3 of the album was done on like that. There was such incredible coherence between them. They could crank out like 4 or 5 new songs
Oh, they also had the money to
down.
just like do right in the studio.
Right in the studio.
But still,
first take.
Yeah,
exactly. So that is a kind of field connection that was trained and developed, and the results are just extraordinary. So that's more of an example from your world.
Well, we never liked hearing that when we were, or I didn't like hearing that when I was there. You got to pay your dues, blah, blah, blah. But then when I think about it, I had this really crappy bass. So my brother was my older brother picked up the bass guitar first, and it was terrible. And I started playing it. And then when I finally got a good one for my birthday, it was like I was such a better player. Like as soon as I took the bass out of the case and plugged it in, because I had spent so much time trying to get a good tone out of this thing that it had no good tone in it. So then when I got a good bass, it was like super easy. Same like in the early days of my first band that really hit the road, the AR. We were playing every crappy club, just like you say with the Beatles, just the crappiest situations, just long hours, just night after night. So after 10,000 of those, when I got into a good venue where I could hear and I had good equipment and everything is set up, well, yeah, it's like really easy to play an incredible show because I've done one in the worst circumstances, up until that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the same thing happened to me at Burning Man. So at Burning Man in 2003, a group of us launched the first speaker series. It's called Palenque Norte, and you can hear all of those in the Psychedelic Salon podcast. And the conditions were terrible. Like we took a tape recording unit to Burning Man in 2003 and it broke right away. Right,
yeah, the dust just got all in.
That's it. And so I had a little early Sony voice recorder that was like stereo and stuff. I whipped it out, taped it to a stick, and then Alex and Allison Gray could speak, and the Shulgins could speak, and everything. And that's the only way we saved that first 2003 session. And it's like, and then in subsequent years, like 2006, I'm doing my whole talk, in this huge tent, and a windstorm comes up and starts ripping it apart. So like the ceiling comes off of the earth, and then etc. And everyone's still chill as I'm still going. There's still power to the mic, and it's just like coming apart. And I figured that was my 10,000 hours of doing public talks. You just don't get phased at all.
It's all a breeze after that. Oh my God, I love it, man. I love it. Well, I don't want to keep you for super long. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. There's so many other things that I know we could talk about and we could go forever. And hopefully you'll come back and we'll do it some more. And they just announced the Sphere dates for Dead and Company.
Oh, so
if you're in Vegas and you want to come by the Sphere, I can help you out with that because it's a pretty amazing experience.
Oh my God. Kathryn, I've been watching the Sphere shows. It's like, what genius download led to this,
Man, this is what, you were saying something before about like, if we can get science to like take this seriously and catch up a little bit after this 60-year break. I think it's possible for that to happen at hyperspeed because the paradigm is changing.
Mm-hmm.
So the more people, and I'm cool with psychedelics if it's, done responsibly as a convenient way to like boot up, you know what I mean? To like jumpstart these things.
Mm-hmm.
But even just if the paradigm shifts and we're allowed to believe and accept that we can do these things, then we can I call it pre-membering, pulling from this field,
mm-hmm.
we can do this fast.
We
and we obviously need to because
we need to.
We're running out of time on a number of different fronts rapidly.
And we think of this as like the end of any good Hollywood crime thriller is a car
where the
chase.
door is coming down.
The door is coming and you have to roll under it. Like in Aliens, right? They're always rolling under doors that are coming down. So that
so that's why I say if we can be the aliens that are come to save us ourselves, we could do this, but we gotta like chop. We gotta give the program.
Yeah, we're getting better and better. We're getting better and the whole planet, that's the untold story is how sharp we're getting and how skillful we're getting. Because we can connect like this, so easily.
I mean, look at this. Like, I would be in fear of the feds coming after me or whatever to like even have this conversation. The fact that we have the technology to have this conversation and us be in control of it, and it goes out to the whole world, and us not have to worry about the feds coming knocking on our door because of it. I mean, obviously we're in it's like racing ahead. So yeah, I'm here with a bellows to try to fan the flames and let's accelerate this thing, however you want to do it, because it's I think we're definitely running out of time.
Or we have just the right amount of time
Just
and
enough.
stimulus and stress and reasons to grow. What many people talk about, waking up and growing up, right? We're going to wake up and grow up, and then we're going to lift ourselves up. And it's just good old fashioned stress that causes evolution in nature is we brought it on ourselves.
I mean, we've seen this with like people's superpower, what we consider superpowers that come because of trauma, right? Like you could do a mushroom trip and open these things, or something awful could happen to you and it just gets squeezed out of you. No. But like you said, the stress is that's one of the natural ways we get it out. Like
that's it. All the greatest creations probably came from non-optimal. You didn't have a nice cushy office when you created that new science or invention or album, or movie. You had a crappy circumstance you were barely able to hold together, and we got Star Wars, and we got Yellow Submarine, and
yeah, it's amazing. We got the blues.
Yeah.
And God, I think, God, wow. Should we all be grateful for slavery because of the American art forms that we wouldn't even have?
Yeah.
Were it not for, it's just weird to think like, wow.
Yeah. It's like the whole thing is required.
Yeah.
All of the aspects of being human are required to, create our future and brilliance, and to create the most beautiful, heartfelt things.
I think about that with, when I try to make it more palatable to myself or more acceptable to myself, or my kids say, I just think about childbirth, like think about how hard that is.
Yeah.
Like how many things have to come together in exactly the right way to actually just get pregnant. Then you have to go through the 9 months. Then it gets worse and worse and worse.
And then our heads got too big for easy childbirth. So we had to have skills, we had to do it, help it along.
I mean, right at the last part, like both the baby and the mom could die. There's, it's just like, and same way with death, unless you die in your sleep, like coming in here and getting out of here is pretty rough. But, the in-between part can be where we would say it's worth it. I mean, so, yeah.
Well, it's totally worth having this conversation with you, worth it. And I look forward to the next one and maybe seeing you at the Sphere sometime in Vegas.
Well, I really hope you make it, and I will make sure that you could get in there and see the the wonder. And I'm glad that you're glad we had this conversation. It makes me feel good because a lot of times I'm so tickled that I even get the guests that I get because I'm like, I can't believe they decided to do my podcast.
And at the Sphere, I want to see the projectors. I want to see behind the scenes of how they create, because that's the Sphere's field, right?
I haven't even been. I don't know. I heard there's like 100,000 speakers or something crazy, and they're all aimed in these different. And the whole thing is like I have that Oz is still all behind the curtain for me. If I'll see who I can ask if they can get you that look to see what's going on there.
I want to see the geek, the god behind the geekdom of that reality. Well, absolutely a pleasure, and so glad we met in the last 2 weeks. And it'd be great to have your input into Minds, and you're kind of part of the Minds network at this point.
I would be honored. I would be most honored, and I'm sure we'll be in contact, off screen too. And thank you so much. What a great time having you on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Till next time.